Captain's log, stardate 9/11.
Otherwise known as July 6, 1995, saw the creation of the website Newgrounds. The site would become known for hosting user-made content such as videos, art, and music, but it would be remembered primarily for its impact on the mediums of both independent video games and internet animation, where it served as something of a hotspot for these mediums in the early days of the World Wide Web. On November 26, 2005, Charlie the Unicorn was released on the site and rapidly grew in popularity. In 2006, it made its way to video sharing website YouTube, where it became one of the most watched videos on the site during its early days. Incidentally, this is both when and where I first saw it. This whole process and its immense success led to the creator Jason Steele creating multiple sequels to it and other animated projects, both in the form of one-shots and other animated series, with a primary focus on quick-witted absurdist and dark comedy, all under the YouTube channel that would be known as FilmCow. I've had to describe the comedy present in each series.
Charlie!
What do you want?
Yeah, that'll do it. That being said, each series did have its own unique flavour of madness. The ones that I was familiar with during this time period were Charlie the Unicorn, which was based around incoherent non sequiturs, gaslighting the poor sod, and musical numbers for some reason. Marshmallow People was based on existential nihilism that was brought about by boredom, which was brought about from what seemed to be an inability to feel satisfaction or joy, and also whatever this was.
Every time you fall asleep, you die. Someone else wakes up in your body thinking they are you.
Oh!
We're moving swiftly on before I think about that too much. We then had what is today's topic, Llamas with hats.
Carl! There is a dead human in our house!
Oh, hey! How did he get here?
An absurdist comedy series about a perfectly normal, aside from the fact that he can talk, llama called Paul, and Carl, a
dangerous sociopath with a long history of violence.
Yeah, that. But I mean, he can't be all bad. Look, he brought muffins.
All of them are bran.
Bastard! So here's the tale. Llamas with Hats episode 1 was released on the 19th of February 2009. And opens up with Carl having stabbed a guy 37 times in the chest. He then cut off the hands and proceeded to eat them, and it's only going to get darker from here.
My stomach was making the rumblies
Carl!
that only hands would satisfy.
You know, I certainly hope that this consumption of hands will become a recurring motif that will eventually materialize in Carl developing ethereal psychokinetic hand powers further down the line. Anyway, each episode depicts the escalation of Carl's actions, all of them horrendously violent, from destroying an entire cruise liner to destroying the lifeboat so that there would be no survivors, to toppling governments, to nuking a city and then hooking skinned off faces on balloons to use as birthday decorations. Sure, why not? We never actually see Carl doing any of this, nor him doing basically anything throughout the series.
I literally never see you move!
To be clear, he is the one doing it, but the actual content of the series, as well as the source of its comedy, lays in the back and forths between Carl and Paul, standing around and talking about what exactly Carl has done after it's already happened, and witnessing the after effects of it in the background.
Oh, that was a foot. I appear to have swallowed an entire person.
That would be the hotel bartender.
Well, that explains why my mojito is taking so long.
That is essentially the entire series in one clip. Now, Paul is usually utterly horrified by what Carl has done, aside from this one time in episode 5 after the nuke birthday face balloon incident, and when confronted with Carl having opened up a hole in space-time to collect baby hands. Paul is underwhelmed because in comparison this is relatively tame.
I think I was expecting worse.
Worse?
Meanwhile, Carl commits these atrocities. The breaking point occurs in episode 6 when Paul has finally had enough and leaves, and Carl starts to unravel mentally throughout the course of the next few episodes. He tries to use a sheep as a replacement for Paul at one point.
I disagreed with the election results.
Well, that answers where Carl was on January 6th. Anyway, this fails because the sheep acts in ways Carl doesn't like, and he isn't getting the reaction that he wants from it. Then tries to get Paul back and fails because of course he does. And then he tries to recreate Paul's voice himself by using a mask he's made as a stand-in for Paul's actual presence, and having barely coherent arguments with himself. By this point it's pretty clear he's just completely lost the plot. At which point...
Carl!
Who said that?
It was me, Carl!
So the damned mask starts floating and speaking to him and encourages him to, quote, finish his work. From this point on, it becomes a borderline horror show, episode 10 in particular taking a total tonal shift away from nearly any comedic elements whatsoever, and depicts Carl as being stuck in his own gore pit with some sort of creature lurking in the background, and the tone is more akin to a video game where you're being hunted down and are virtually defenseless like Alien Isolation or Amnesia: The Dark Descent, as opposed to funny llamas hats are a people thing. Still, he and the Paul mask managed to get out between episodes, and they continue to finish what Carl has started. Episode 11 depicts Carl as having eradicated all of civilization, only for the mask to keep telling Carl he needs to finish his work, while Carl insists that he's done because there's nothing left. As they bicker, Carl accuses the mask of not actually being Paul and sets off to find him. Episode 12 is the final episode. It aired on the 13th of February 2015, and results in Carl finding Paul's corpse, the mask no longer floating behind him, and instead firmly around his neck, revealing it to have been a hallucination, a manifestation of Carl's subconscious the entire time. Paul is dead, and has been dead for a long time, and Carl's simply been deluding himself that Paul has been with him throughout his destruction of Earth. So this means that every time Carl has had a conversation with the mask, he has just been talking to himself, and the mask's responses have been in his head. This means that we're seeing the story from Carl's perspective, so just for fun I thought that it would be worth editing a few scenes to show what the average person would see if they were watching Carl from the perspective of reality.
I'm kinda just freestyling it these days, taking things as they come. I am, aren't I? I am Carl. That's me. You sure like your yelling.
With Carl's work being the destruction of all living beings, and himself being the only living thing left, "You must finish your work, Carl" takes on a fairly dark meaning, and that is exactly how the episode ends, with Carl throwing himself off a bridge, presumably, finally, wrapping everything up. In episode 2, Carl had described forgiveness as the sound of screaming and then silence.
Do you hear that? That's the sound of forgiveness.
That's the sound of people drowning, Carl.
That is what forgiveness sounds like. Screaming and then silence.
This was mirrored in the final episode. Carl was screaming his own name as he imitated Paul, and the background orchestral music swelled only to stop the second that Carl hit the water.
Carl!
I didn't do that.
Carl! Carl!
And that was how the series remained, until September 28th, 2024, 15 years after the first episode aired, and nearly 10 years after the release of episode 12, FilmCow released a new, updated series epilogue, aimed at wrapping up the whole saga once and for all.
Do you think I'm beyond redemption?
And this is what I want to talk about. This epilogue is what I can only describe as a surrealist overdose, filtered through the total deconstruction of Carl as a character, and perhaps most importantly, it's turned what would have just been a comedy series about an insane llama having funny conversations into something I can actually analyse and sink my teeth into. It's unique in a number of ways, to the epilogue being longer than the rest of the series combined, although that was also the case for Charlie the Unicorn, so that might not be that unique to Steele's work, to us actually seeing the characters doing things rather than talking about them, to the setting being entirely inconsistent. Sometimes it's a blank void, sometimes it's a recreation of a house, sometimes it's a meadow at night, and sometimes it's something completely incomprehensible. As a matter of fact, it's not actually clear where Carl even is or what has happened, if this is an actual place he's interacting with, if it's the afterlife, or Carl's psyche just unraveling as he drowns. Whatever the answer to that question is though, the central question of the epilogue's narrative is if Carl is capable of redemption of any sort after everything he's done. Everything throughout this episode is an exploration of that concept, of what exactly redemption for such a character could even look like. And it's a genuinely thought-provoking question explored in a really interesting way. And my answer to it is complicated, frankly. To explore my answer to that question, we need to take a bit of a deeper look at the series broadly. I'm going to break apart the series, comedy and all, and see what we can really say about it when all is said and done. That's right, I'm going to overanalyze a comedy series about a pair of talking animals and deconstruct the comedy because I'm the kind of person that you could put on an asteroid floating in space with no air and I'd still find a way to suck all the atmosphere out of a room. But I'm not doing this just because I hate fun, although I do enjoy messing with people. No, I'm doing it because, in part, I think that the epilogue relies on doing that. Its narrative is a lot more grounded, which looking at these screenshots is kind of a hilarious thing to say, but it's true. It's more focused on the consequences of the original 12 episodes. Jason Steele is very good at writing scenes that have multiple meanings, and Llamas with Hats does show that. On the surface, it's a "I like your funny words, llama" series. Underneath it, there's some hidden horrific stuff going on alongside the openly horrific stuff going on, and underneath that, there's some meta-commentary happening. And I do enjoy that, but to really get into the weeds, we have to peel all of that back. But first things first though, I'm gonna be honest, I really wanted to do a baby hands joke to go with episode 6, but I couldn't think of any. So, subscribe, like the video, comment on it, call me a twat if you like, provide me with engagement, support me on Patreon if you're a future historian, immortalize me in the annals of history, or pay.
And the payment is baby hands.
Alright, there we go, we've brute forced our way through that, I've hit my quota, let's crack on with the analysis, shall we? So, Llamas with Hats, I think, is a series that you could cut straight down the middle and treat both parts of it as totally different yet interconnected analytical entities. That doesn't make any sense, I hear you say, to which I respond with, give me a fucking minute and I'll explain. Originally, Llamas with Hats was 12 episodes long and remained like that for 10 years. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that Steele's plan wasn't to wait for 10 years before making an epilogue. To me, what it looks like happened was that they finished episode 12, considered the series finished, and then got a new idea for what an epilogue could look like, and created that down the line. This has created a series which has two very different thematic through lines halfway through the runtime. Episodes 1 through 4, for instance, start out as being entirely comedic before it sort of shifts into a more esoteric, the dynamic between content creator and the demands of the audience type thing. Carl often refers to himself as an artist, Paul representing the audience's initial shock before getting used to things, causing Carl to have to one-up himself constantly before the dynamic just deteriorates with the sheep. The artist tries to get his audience back, and then the mask shows a new audience that just wants more of the same until you're literally scraping the bottom of the gore pit barrel by episode 10, making callback to the glory days, and what made the series appeal to people in the first place is just gone. This isn't me looking too deeply into things, by the way. This has been analysed before, and Steele has confirmed that this was the intention with the series by around episode 5. By the time the epilogue came out, this knowledge about the rest of the series had been well known for literally a decade. This also means I get to reuse my favourite joke. You think I'm overanalyzing things and that Llamas with Hats has no deeper meaning or alternative interpretations? Here's the creator literally confirming what I've said word for word. Disagree with me now, dickhead. So if it's all the same to everyone else, I'm going to take this as a go-ahead to overanalyze the crap out of this entire series. The other half of the series is the epilogue itself. The audience expectation versus content creator theme seems to have just mostly gone, and instead is replaced with a deconstruction of the relationship between the characters of Paul and Carl. None of this audience and creator stuff, just these two, within the context of the story. They're working from completely different themes and telling completely different stories to one another, but they are still interconnected. Though they're focusing on very different things, they still refer to one another quite well. They don't contradict anything that the other says, and they tie it together easily. The epilogue does actually let you recontextualize parts of the rest of the series as well, which is why I did a very quick micro review of the first half of the series here, just so we're all on the same page and can all go ahead with this information to mind as we jump into the epilogue. But I also did it because the epilogue seems to consciously invite you to take the rest of the series into consideration. In its introduction sequence, a phone slides into frame, leaving a bloody trail behind it. It then turns on, and we see a scene depicting a conversation typical of the series. It shows Carl and Paul discussing a dismembered hand on the floor, which is later revealed to have been Carl attacking a plumber and biting his hands off.
I believe I said nibble. Words mean things.
No one likes a pedant, Carl. It seems to suggest that if you were to put every episode on a timeline, this occurs before episode 1, and is Carl's first act of violence that would come to characterize the series. This is even reflected in Paul's reaction to it, which is less comedic horror and more just straight up horror.
I can't believe you're capable of such a thing.
He seems disturbed by Carl even having the capacity to do such a thing, which would make no sense if he had already seen Carl murder a guy and eat their hands. Remember, one of the central cores of the original 12 episodes was escalation. If we treat this as a prequel episode, then this would fit that theme. Start with a hand, move up to a person, move up to multiple people, etc, etc.
I, Carl, solemnly swear, on my honor as County Comptroller and President of the PTA, that I will never harm a living soul ever again.
That's turned out to be a lie. This may be a product of the epilogue coming out nearly 10 years after the original series finale, but to me, this almost feels like the epilogue is trying to indicate that you should go back to the beginning. Remind yourself of what exactly Carl has done. So that's all we're going to do here, real quick. We've already recapped the episode, so what we're going to do is instead look at Carl's actions specifically and build up a profile of him and what he's done before we go into the content of the epilogue. Carl has openly described himself as sociopathic, and that's a pretty apt description. He's prone to violence, and to him, even the smallest slight is a justification to indulge in it. In episode 2, he admits to killing an elderly couple for taking crescent rolls. In episode 6, he admits to burying a woman alive for not keeping up with weeding. In most cases, though, he barely even seems to need a justification for what he's doing. He'll just go ahead and do it for no other reason than he feels like it. Throughout most of the episodes, Carl will initially deny having done any of this and sometimes claim to not even remember having done them at all. He will eventually relent and even sometimes agree that what he has done is morally reprehensible, and then do it again more or less straight away, indicating he either doesn't understand what he's actually done and why it's immoral, or he just doesn't care. On other occasions though, like in episode 6, he will defend his actions no matter how reprehensible they are in order to avoid taking any real responsibility for his actions.
Everything? Even that time I helped Mrs. Bigsby with her garden?
You buried her there!
It's what she would have wanted.
You buried her alive!
She wasn't keeping up with the weeding.
As the episodes go on, it becomes clear that one of, if not the entire reason Carl is doing this is to get a reaction out of Paul, which he seems to find to be the main source of satisfaction out of all of this. Episode 3 helps to demonstrate this, where Carl claims he will have to try harder to get a reaction out of Paul when the latter claims to no longer be shocked by Carl's antics. That directly leads into the nuking of the city in the subsequent episode 4. Episode 5 helps to demonstrate this further by showing Carl as being upset when Paul isn't as horrified with the whole baby hands thing.
I think I was expecting worse.
Worse? But this is totally fucked, bro.
I know, but after last time with the nuke and the faces, it's just...
Come on, look at this. How did I even do this?
I don't understand how or why you do anything.
Do you know what it feels like to be Carl right now? It hurts. Not as much as the babies, but it hurts.
Jesus Christ. Many of his subsequent attempts to replace Paul are also proof of this. He seems to crave that back and forth. Episode 10 also helps to reinforce this. The Paul mask, which again we must remember is a figment of Carl's imagination, prompts him into doing the normal back and forth. And while initially Carl refuses, he then does relent and engages in it. He even denies that he made the gore pit, despite having mentioned that he made the gore pit in the first place earlier in the episode.
Oh, it's my gore pit. That's not gonna work. I'm in too bad a mood.
Carl!
Alright. Oh, hey, how did all these bodies get down here?
You killed all these people, Carl!
Collecting piles of human meat is my least favorite thing to do.
Carl!
I am a rascal, just a no-good troublemaker. That's me.
All this, but episode 10 especially, confirms to me that Carl does all of this because he enjoys the back and forth arguments he has with Paul. That's what he craves more so than anything else. When he finds that Paul died long before he found him again, Carl loses his will to live and jumps off a bridge, which leads us into our epilogue. Sociopaths can be erratic, impulsive, lack an understanding or ability to conform to social norms, and have little empathy. But they are capable of it, and they are capable of feeling genuinely strong emotions for other people. If Carl didn't have genuine feelings of affection for Paul, I find it hard to believe that he would have thrown himself off a bridge upon learning about his death. Of course, that hasn't stopped him from killing basically everything else on the planet and feeling nothing whatsoever about it, but it is worth noting that it was Paul's death that pushed Carl over the edge himself. So that's Carl, a sociopathic madman who seeks to get a reaction out of the one person he has a genuine attachment to and feels nothing about mass slaughter for the rest of existence in order to do it. With that in mind, we can look deeper into the epilogue now. Let's quickly recap it. So, after jumping off the bridge, Carl is saved by a pair of ethereal glowing hands, which take him to some sort of surrealist scape where a recreation of his house materializes around him and puts his hat back on his head. Paul's voice can be heard echoing Carl's name in the distance, indicating that he's here somewhere. After this, a tube appears from the ceiling, full of testicle-looking meat and sounds like Wheeljack from Transformers for some reason.
We really need your help. Why won't you give us a hand?
Yeah, that's the question, huh?
They even both do the glow-up thing when they speak. Was that intentional? Oh, I just realized it's the Joey Wheeler voice. They're from Brooklyn. I have more questions now. Anyway, it claims that they are ready for Carl. And literally seconds after meeting it, Carl manifests psychokinetic hands, and I was worried that this was going to happen, and instantly snaps the tube with the intention to consume the meat. The meat then transfers Carl into a void and disappears. Carl then claims to be sorry, and when the tube returns, he instantly snaps it again, and this time consumes it successfully. Eating the tube meat does this to him, somehow, after flinging himself using his hand powers, Carl ends up in a replica of where he first met Paul.
I always thought of you as made of moonlight. Because of that first night.
Okay, that is the most romantic thing I've ever heard in my life, and you can be damn sure it's going to play a part in the final analysis. It then transitions to another, this time very eerie scene, where he's speaking with a faceless version of Paul. This is easily my favourite scene in the entire epilogue just for how brilliantly atmospheric it is. Upon suggesting that they play truth or dare, Carl asks Paul why he left. I think it's best if I just let you watch what happens.
Why? Why did you leave?
There are threads that hold us together, Carl. Threads that connect us to every other living soul.
You left me over knitting?
Every time you killed someone, you cut another thread. One by one by one by one. And eventually, there just weren't any left. I didn't leave you, Carl. You left the world.
I choose dare.
Bury yourself in a deep hole. Stay there forever. Spend the rest of time in darkness and solitude. Free the rest of us from you.
Genuinely terrifying. One neat trick I noticed is that if you watch the original 12 episodes of the series, Carl and Paul will sort of talk over one another as they transition between lines of dialogue. Here, they fully let one another finish, and it just adds to this feeling of something not being quite right. It's great. Anyway, starting off into a hole of darkness. Carl then does that. And then, the meat tube makes its second appearance. Interestingly, it's the only character other than Carl himself that makes an appearance in more than one scene. Carl declares his intention to be good from now on to earn Paul's forgiveness, to which the two meet is very skeptical and says that he thinks Carl is on the wrong track. When Carl asks why, the meat says,
You don't deserve forgiveness. You killed everyone you ever met, Carl. Literally everyone.
Yeah, and I feel very bad about it.
You only feel bad when something you want gets taken away from you.
Stop it.
You never feel bad when you're ripping things away from everyone else.
Following that, he takes another swig of tube meat, distorts, and then has a dance number with a sentient mountain of his own victim. Sweet mother of Christ. It then flattens him, and he begins to converse with an acorn.
Do you think I'm beyond redemption?
Yes.
Well, that's blunt. Throughout their conversation, Carl talks about some of the atrocities he committed, all of which are hula hoop themed.
You must love hula hoops.
Not really. I just killed so many people that there happens to be multiple hula hoop examples.
He also talks about how he's not really done much other than saying he's sorry to fix things. The acorn tells him that that isn't going to cut it and that there aren't any solutions for him anymore. It then tells Carl to become a tree. Carl doesn't see how that will help and then crushes the acorn. Carl then stretches himself out and goes looking for Paul, only to find his corpse. And for the first time in the series, Carl seems to truly acknowledge what has happened, and that it's because of him.
He's dead. And it's my fault. I did this. Carl did this.
The scene then transitions into their home backdrop again, this time flooding with water, and Carl hears Paul's voice again. He yells that he doesn't think that things are going to work out for him this time, but Paul may still have a chance.
I think I'm lost, Paul. I don't think things are going to work out for me. But you've still got a chance. As long as you stay away from me. Or I stay away from you.
Then we see Carl's body washed away, but from his hat comes an acorn. The psychokinetic hands bury the acorn in a desert, where it then grows into a tree, and with the moon in the sky, both gain a hat. Carl's on the tree, and Paul's on the moon. And then we cut back to the phone from the beginning as everything fades out, indicating that the series has ended once and for all. So what are my thoughts? I think that there are primarily two different ways that one can engage with this epilogue, and that the epilogue itself goes to great lengths to hide which of them, if either, are really correct. Option number one is that this is some kind of afterlife. This is a fairly straightforward conclusion to come to. The fact that Carl threw himself off a bridge with the intention to end his own life is kinda all you need to reach that one. Option number 2 is that this is all in Carl's head and his psyche is unraveling while he drowns. This is alluded to in a number of ways, but the biggest one to me is the noticeably reoccurring element of water showing up in multiple scenes, which could symbolize drowning. Neither of these 2 points contradict one another. There is a third option, I suppose, and that's that everything that is happening is literal and actually happening in reality in some form, but I'm going to be honest with you, that would break my analysis a little bit. I mean, there's technically nothing that contradicts this, but I don't know where to go with it. So we're going to be sticking with the afterlife and / or mind unraveling theories. I also want to cover the literal narrative of the epilogue as well, since it was that narrative that made me interested in talking about the epilogue in the first place. The original 12 episodes fit into the absurdist genre, and while there are elements of it in the epilogue, I think that the epilogue itself falls firmly under the surrealist genre. And surrealism in film is a genre which is designed to be heavily prone to individual interpretation, where 2 different people watching the same thing at the same time can come to wildly different and equally valid interpretations of what they're witnessing, because surrealism tends to rely heavily on symbolism, and people can interpret symbols differently. Of course, exceptions always exist, and it's not necessarily always the intention to get people speculating about symbology, but it is the natural consequence of surrealism being what it is. And Llamas with Hats here seems to be leaning into the symbology quite a bit. Which is great in an artistic sense, but bad for me because I have to try and convey all my thoughts about it here and make sense of something borderline nonsensical. I think that the easiest way to do that is to follow the narrative presented, and each of the characters, their speaking roles, and explain what exactly they could mean or what they could symbolize. That leaves us with Carl, the faceless, I'm gonna call it a ghost of Paul, the tube meat, the mountain of flesh, and the acorn. Carl we're going to do last, since we can wrap up this whole thing with a conclusion for him. For the others, I actually think that the best way to do this is to just go in chronological order of appearance. So that's going to be tube meat, then the ghost of Paul, then the tube of meat again, then the mountain of flesh, and then the acorn, and then Carl for our conclusion. But the mountain of flesh doesn't talk, I hear you say. And that's true. It does scream though, and I'm going to count that as dialogue and you can't stop me. So starting with the tube meat. It's unique in that I've put it on this list twice because, as I said, unlike every other character other than Carl himself, it appears twice in 2 separate scenes. I have 2 different ideas for what the tube meat could represent, so we're going to do this first one in his first appearance and then the second one in his second appearance. One is the purpose of this tube, and what it is that it is irrelevant. It is an angel from heaven, a demon from hell, Osiris from the field of reeds, Hades, some other afterlife figure, a figment of Carl's imagination, his own brain, considering it looks a lot like a llama's brain. Whatever it is, whatever it's trying to do, here at least, is entirely irrelevant, and does not matter in the slightest. It represents nothing. It exists entirely to convey exactly what Carl's instant thought process is after discovering something else alive: to kill and consume it. He literally does not even think twice about it, and only apologizes when he fails the first time to try and get at it again. It's a reminder of who Carl really is on the inside. A violent lunatic who doesn't think twice about just taking what he wants, and damn the consequences for everyone else. Him doing this actually sets up the tube meat for its second appearance, where he calls Carl out on only feeling bad when something he wants is taken from him. It's a pretty effective way of reminding us of who exactly Carl is. Moving on to Ghost Paul, I think that this varies less depending on interpretation. Only the specifics of what it actually is do. Let me try and explain. First, we see him in the meadow, with Carl made out of blue ethereal light, as Carl says he's always thought of Paul as made of moonlight. The main purpose of this scene, I feel, is to cement one particular fact. Carl does care about Paul and thinks highly of him. The exact nature of this care is unspecific. It could just be as a friend, it could perhaps be romantic. Like I said, saying someone is made of moonlight is the most romantic goddamn thing I've ever heard in my life. Ultimately, the exact nature of this affection doesn't matter, only that Carl has it. In a definitional sense, Carl is psychotic. He either is not capable of empathy or just doesn't care. But that doesn't apply to Paul. He does have an emotional attachment to him. He'll go to extreme lengths to try to win him back, to find him in this abstract escape. And it's to the point that when Carl rediscovers Paul's corpse, the entire screen is red. Paul glows white. Paul is Carl's singular focus, and nothing else matters or even exists outside of them. All of this tells us that Carl does care for Paul. It isn't an act, it is genuine affection. Then we transition to the scene in the house where the faceless version of Paul is speaking with Carl. The fact that it's faceless here suggests a sort of lack of personhood to me. This can be taken in two ways. If this epilogue takes place within Carl's subconscious, then the answer is easy. It's a manifestation of how Carl sees his rejection by Paul coming through more clearly. Carl is shown to be fully aware of what he's doing and that it's wrong throughout multiple episodes. He just doesn't care all that much and keeps doing them anyway. Assuming that he doesn't know that what he's doing is wrong is unbelievably charitable, frankly. If this is a version of some kind of afterlife, my interpretation is a bit more abstract. Something else is going on here. I don't think that Carl is actually speaking to Paul here. Maybe some kind of manifestation of Paul's unfiltered thoughts and his will or something? I'm not too sure, but whatever it is, this isn't Paul. Either way though, the result is more or less the exact same. We do know that Carl does genuinely care about Paul, but time and time again, Carl constantly oversteps the many boundaries that Paul set up throughout the series. That's virtually the entire series. Carl doing more and more horrific shit, and Paul pleading with him to just stop, giving him more chances than he deserves, or should have gotten in the first place. Whatever Carl's affection for Paul might be, watching the series, it's hard to think of him as seeing Paul as much of a person with his own needs. That or again, he just doesn't care. The result is this faceless proxy of Paul, which comes into being, perhaps saying what Paul never could, or perhaps saying what deep down Carl realizes what Paul wanted, for him to just go away. Whatever the case, that then leads us into our next scene. The faceless Paul tells Carl to bury himself in a hole and stay there, and Carl goes and does that, allowing us our second interaction with the tube meat.
Didn't I eat you?
If we want to move a little bit away from the abstract, the fact that the tube meat comes back after Carl snapped it in half and ate it somewhat indicates that whatever this thing is, it isn't something that Carl can really get rid of. It'll come back. This is the scene where the tube meat tells Carl flat out that he doesn't deserve forgiveness. What's interesting about this scene is that it is perhaps the first time in the series where Carl isn't relishing in being reminded of the things that he's done. In the other episodes of the series, when Paul is decrying him for doing all the horrible things that he's done, Carl is obviously enjoying it. At this time though, he's made uncomfortable.
You only feel bad when something you want gets taken away from you.
Stop it.
This is what leads me into my second possible idea about the meat tube. As I said, first scene is to establish that what it is in the grand scheme of the epilogue doesn't really matter in the slightest because Carl is going to react to it in the same way he reacts to basically every other living being he comes across. But that doesn't necessarily inherently mean or contradict the idea that it does have some role within the context of the story itself. If you're writing something and you want to have a character that's a stand-in for something more abstract like a political or philosophical position, that's fine, but you still have to put the work in to contextualize them, what they're doing here, and give them character. I just find it interesting that out of everything, this is the only thing that shows up twice. So my secondary interpretation, which in no way contradicts the first, once again varies depending on if we're taking the afterlife or mind unraveling theory into consideration. If this is an afterlife analysis, then I think that this could represent some sort of guardian angel type figure, some sort of spiritual guide that knows him and the things that he's done, and is supposed to guide Carl to whatever is supposed to come next. If this is a mind unraveling analysis, then I think that this could represent Carl's own subconscious, the part of him that is actually capable of empathy and self-reflection, starting to break through to him. If you actually look, a llama's brain is a pretty similar shape to the tube meat, enough that it starts to make me think that this is, in a way, Carl talking to himself, and deep down, understanding that what he's done is beyond forgiveness. But Carl, because of who he is, lashes out. He then consumes the meat and becomes warped again, which leads us into the meat mountain thing. So, the meat mountain is a weird one, but a pretty simple one as well. The meat is a pile of corpses that Carl dances alongside, and I think it's pretty clear that the corpses are meant to be some of his victims. This is actually one where I don't think the afterlife or mind unraveling theory changes anything about this scene. I think it's pretty clear cut and has the same answer either way. I got a question for you. If Carl actually felt bad about the things that he had done, don't you think that this would horrify him? That he'd plead forgiveness, attempt to back away from it, or even look vaguely upset at what is in front of him? But no, he just dances alongside it. He doesn't stop what he's doing. He doesn't even flinch. I think that this makes it very clear that Carl doesn't actually feel bad about the things that he's done. even when presented with a reminder directly in front of him, literally screaming at him. He doesn't stop or recoil, he just keeps on dancing. He was having a jolly fun time dancing, just like he had a jolly fun time causing all the destruction that he did, and he's not going to let something like guilt stop him. He goes splat, and then we get to the acorn. Now, the acorn is where I think the main thesis statement of the epilogue really makes itself clear, and it's going to be what ties back into the ending. As Carl describes all the things that he's done to the acorn, it tells him fairly bluntly that just saying that he's sorry isn't going to fix this, and that there isn't any solution for him anymore. And the acorn is right, if for no other reason than literally everyone else is dead. What forgiveness or redemption can Carl get from a planet made up entirely of corpses? Unless he's found a way to raise the dead in some form other than the meat creatures, there literally aren't any solutions for him. I mean, he even kind of implies that he's eaten all the flesh on the planet, so I'm not sure he would even have the materials to create regular living creatures even if he wanted to.
Must complete your work, Carl.
All the hands are eaten, all the meat creatures are made, unleashed, and then also eaten.
Ew. It then tells him that he could become an acorn too, and become a tree. And this, I think, is what is central to the ultimate thesis of the epilogue here. I think that what this acorn is saying here is meant to represent renewal. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but something else. Carl isn't going to get what he wants, and what he wants is Paul back. But Paul is dead, and even if this is some version of the afterlife, Paul isn't running up to greet Carl. He's staying as far away from him as he can manage. Literally the moon, for God's sake. If nothing else, that represents distance. And even if, somehow against all sense and logic, Carl did manage to get Paul back, what then? The world is still in ruins. There are no more cruise ships to sink, no more cities to destroy, no more meat creatures to consume, there are no more hands to eat.
It's all gone.
Even if he got Paul back, what would it accomplish? The main thing that Carl found satisfaction out of the relationship is now long gone. Best case scenario for him in this scenario is that he somehow starts finding a way to kill people who are already dead in the afterlife. I mean, he did manage to crush that acorn, so who knows. But then, if that is what he does, then all that's happened here is he's recreated the pattern by which Paul abandoned him in the first place. It'll just happen again. We just finished watching Carl dancing with a horrific amalgamation of his victims, and him crushing an acorn for saying things he didn't want to hear. The tube meat is what I forgot about the tube meat. The two quote-unquote living things he finds in this place, he murders within seconds of encountering them. He can't help himself. There is no solution to Carl's problem. Or perhaps more accurately, there is no solution to Carl's problem that will fix things in a way that Carl is happy with. Perhaps the closest he can get is becoming something new. And that ties us into Carl's final scene, where he recognizes that Paul is dead, and that it's his fault. As the scene transitions back to a depiction of their old house starting to flood, Carl yells to the voice of Paul that his best chance is to stay away from him, or for him to stay away from Paul. This marks the first time that Carl takes even the slightest bit of anything even approximating accountability for the consequences of his actions throughout the series. Oh, he'll claim credit for the horrible things he's done, like creating the meat monsters, making the gore pit and mass slaughter, but he never accepts the consequences of his actions. Deflects constantly when Paul leaves. He doesn't so much as apologize when he tries to get him back, and to remove any ambiguity, he says,
I will not apologize for art.
The art in question being the multiplication of people. This scene here is the first time Carl truly takes any accountability for his actions and does something about it, rather than shifting the blame or responsibility onto someone else. The room floods, and from Carl's hat floats a new acorn. If you recall, Ghost Paul told Carl to bury himself in a hole and stay there, and that's exactly what Carl does. For the first time in the series, he does exactly what Paul wanted him to, both in life and wherever the hell they are now. He doesn't get what he wants, but he does what Paul needed him to do, Carl's one truly selfless action. Redemption and forgiveness are tricky topics, especially when they're interwoven with one another and used to mean the same thing, but they aren't really. I like to think that everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done, is capable of redemption, if they choose to work at it. Maybe not forgiveness, but redemption at the very least on a societal level, and I do consider this true for some of the most heinous things that you can imagine. I like to think that murderers, abusers, propagandists, and all manner of people who do bad things are capable of becoming better and redeeming themselves in the sense of them being able to reform, re-enter the world, and contribute to the world to make up for what they've done. Perhaps their victims or their victims' loved ones never forgive them on a personal level. That's something that they'll have to live with. But I believe in offering people that chance on a social level. It does feel like a platitude or something that you'd hear from a series about the ultimate good versus the ultimate evil. In fact, I already brought up Transformers, I may as well do that again. It sounds like something Optimus Prime would say, doesn't it? Maybe the rest of the world won't forgive you, but maybe if you do what you have to do to at least try to heal the damage, maybe you can forgive yourself. But sometimes that really is all you can offer someone. You can redeem yourself without being forgiven. I fully believe that. And heck, if the person you've wronged chooses to, you can be forgiven without redeeming yourself. But in this case, Paul is a victim of Carl here, and has chosen not to forgive Carl. If we assume that Ghost Paul's words are even a proxy of what Paul really wanted from Carl, that much is obvious. With the epilogue, a lot of the series could be recontextualized into a metaphor of a relationship falling apart. You can interpret it as romantic or not, whatever floats your fancy there, but Carl and Paul did have a relationship which deteriorated. But Carl wasn't willing to give it up. He kept trying to put it back together to the way it used to be, even though Paul wanted nothing to do with it anymore. In this particular specific respect, I honestly sympathize and empathize with Carl. Now, to be fair to myself, I haven't slaughtered masses and opened up any blood vortexes over Paris yet, but I have had relationships like that which have fallen apart, imploded because of my own actions, that I tried to force them to be fixed. Most people have had relationships like that, I've learned. Nearly everyone I've ever met has a story like that. Messing up something that you do care about just because you don't know how to properly handle it. I think that's just part of being human at the end of the day. It's impossible to go through life without causing some pain. All we can really do is try to grow from those incidents and try to better ourselves to limit the amount of pain we cause in the future and try to do more good than harm at the very least. In other words, all we can do is try to renew ourselves to become something new to cause less harm in the future. But again, being fair to myself, I didn't intentionally do the things that I did to make those relationships fall apart. Carl did. He knew what he was doing and just kept crossing the boundaries that Paul set up over and over and over again. And we can sympathize and even understand how someone feels, even if they're the ones in the wrong, but that doesn't make them any less in the wrong. Carl wasn't going to get what he wanted out of this whole situation, but he was able to realize that in the end. He realized that he needed to stay away from Paul, and chose to. If we take the scene where he becomes a tree and Paul is reincarnated into the moon, or whatever this scene is showing at face value, Carl still gets to be around and see Paul, while Paul is literally hundreds of thousands of miles away from Carl. This relationship is a toxic one. Carl emotionally harms Paul over and over again for his own amusement, despite genuinely caring for him. It's an abusive relationship by definition. The fact that Carl chose to stay away from him is impactful, because a lot of abusers don't let their victims just leave. Hell, Carl tried to get Paul back multiple times throughout the series, but he did in the end choose to let him go and stay away. That's probably as close to a happy ending as either of them are going to get, and the closest that Carl can get to truly redeeming himself anymore. I've talked a lot about interpreting the epilogue as either taking place in some sort of afterlife or being in Carl's own head as he drowns, but the honest truth is, those are only my interpretations. For all we know, they've been reincarnated into a universe where the laws of physics and the structure of reality are just fundamentally different to how we understand them. I don't think there is a correct answer or way to interpret the epilogue, frankly. Which is fitting because what forgiveness and redemption means and how anyone could earn such a thing varies from person to person and victim to instigator. One person might be more willing to forgive someone they've known for a long time, or they might think that reaching the point of this conversation even happening to be the point of no return. Maybe they'd be willing to forgive a stranger or a close family member, or maybe not. But a person in a room with 10, 20, 100 people, and they may even have different criteria for what they would accept forgiveness for from each of them, or what redemption in their eyes would look like for each. It's not a question with a straightforward answer that can be applied universally. We can ascribe broad definitions of what a person can do to redeem themselves in the eyes of society, or what being forgiven by society at large looks like, but we can't necessarily do that from individuals. We can make arguments for it based on what we think is best, what we consider moral, and the codes by which we live our lives, but we can't force anything in this regard, because it's something personal. And for something this personal, again, there really is no right answer. It's all down to interpretation. Episode 2 ended with Carl saying that the sound of forgiveness was screaming and then silence. Episode 12 ended with Carl screaming and then going silent. The epilogue doesn't end with screaming at all. Make of that what you will.